Start by just giving you a brief introduction to why it is that we at WFP are particularly interested in the work that you do. And then I'll try to leave you with three takeaway points. The first will be a bit of an overview and an understanding of the new Sustainable Development Goals and why they really are so important to the work that all of us are doing. Second, to emphasize something that you already know, which is the importance of nutrition and the importance of the food assistance program and policy environment in the countries that you're working in. And then third is really to leave you with an appreciation for why it's important that we work together and from how I think in different ways we can each help each other. So that's what I'd like to cover in the next 15, 20 minutes. But let me start with, with who we are. Well, the UN World Food Program, as some of you know, is the largest humanitarian organization in the world. We are the largest component of the UN system in terms of operations. Last year, we had global expenditures of about $5.5 billion on a program of work of about $8 billion. So still a gap in what we do, but a large operational footprint. Overall, we reach about 90 million people through direct assistance in about 73 countries. WFP was created in 1961 by the General Assembly of the United Nations with three mandates. One was to provide food assistance in conditions of emergencies. Second was to support school and preschool feeding. And the third was to use food assistance to support economic and social development. Those are the three mandates that the organization has. And in its early days, WFP, which is the 1950s, 60s, 70s, WFP was about 90% focused on development activities. It's a shock to many people, but that's the way the WFP was originally. In the 80s and 90s, due to the rise of conflict and climate-affected natural disasters, WFP shifted to being about 80% focused on emergency response and about 20% focused on development. So almost a complete reversal of the way the organization was in its original days. Currently, WFP is moving, the balance is redressing a little bit. It's still mostly focused on humanitarian activities, but also development activities are becoming increasingly important. And why are we so interested in particular in this issue of food banking and the work that you're doing? And that's because hunger is evolving as an issue. It used to be, even a decade ago, most of our work was in low-income food deficit countries because that's where most of the hungry people in the world were. That's where most of the extreme poverty was. Today, three-quarters of those that are considered in extreme poverty are in what are classified as middle-income countries. And more than 50% of those that are classified globally as undernourished, meaning they're hungry, are in middle-income countries. So it's not the typical image you have of sub-Saharan Africa or countries with low income and availability problems. Actually, the majority of people in the world that are hungry and in need of assistance are in what are classified as middle-income countries. These are countries with gross national income per capita in excess of $1,500 per person. And that changing dynamic, which is only going to increase as more countries become middle-income countries, is what is also driving us to work in different ways. And that is the future. Ethiopia, which for many people is the paradigm of a country requiring food assistance support, Ethiopia will be a middle-income country. They have a program to be a middle-income country by 2025. So the world is evolving, and as the world evolves, responses need to evolve as well. Overall, globally, I'm told that a third of all of the food that is produced for human consumption is wasted somewhere along the chain. And that food, if you took even a quarter of that, 1/3 of all human food production is wasted. If you took even a quarter of that, it would be enough to support 870 million people. Yeah? So more than all of the people that are currently considered undernourished could be supported if you just eliminated a quarter of all the food that is lost in the process of producing it for humans. And that includes the production chain as well as what happens to the food after it's processed. The Sustainable Development Goals will be the focus of international efforts and also of national efforts to create, you may say, the world of the future. And what's different about the Sustainable Development Goals than the Millennium Development Goals is that the Sustainable Development Goals are intended to be universal. That means, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals apply to high-income developed countries as well as to low-income developing countries. They apply to everybody. So the aim is to set standards globally that all countries should aim to meet. And this automatically makes the Sustainable Development Goals much more, I'd say, relevant to everybody globally, but also much more interlinked. And it's also why, while there were 8 Millennium Development Goals, there are currently 17 draft Sustainable Development Goals. And in part, this is because so many issues, which were not part of the agenda for just looking at developing countries, but if you're looking at a world that is interlinked and sustainable, then you need to bring a variety of other factors in. And that's really what has caused the Sustainable Development Goal agenda to expand to currently 17 draft goals. The first goal, and I'm not going to go through all 17, but the first one is to eliminate extreme poverty. Second is to end hunger. Third, and it relates to health, then their goals relating to education, gender, the things that you would expect. But there's also a goal, which is, I think, particularly relevant for this group, and that's goal 12, which is sustainable consumption and production. And within that, there is a target that relates to reducing waste, particularly food waste. So it's a direct part of the Sustainable Goal agenda. And the Sustainable Goals are being negotiated in the Forum of the United Nations, but these are member states negotiating. It's not the UN that decides these are the goals. It's the countries that make up the membership of the United Nations, 193 countries that sit down, mostly in New York, but as a result of global conferences, and they are negotiating the content word for word of each of these goals. That's important because in the end, that's where the ownership of these goals rests. If you don't like what's in the Sustainable Development Goals, it's because that's what governments have negotiated, and that's what they're committing themselves to. So it's a long process. It's taken a few years, but it's also a process that's learning some of the lessons of the Millennium Development Goal process, one of which is that I think the Millennium Development Goals were not really taken seriously globally and by many countries until relatively late in the process. It was just considered another negotiating forum. Let's develop these nice goals. But organizations and governments didn't really put all of their emphasis behind them until relatively late in the process. But that effort now and the utility of actually using these as the focus for your development, that's a legacy of the Millennium Development Goals, and the Sustainable Development Goals are starting right from the beginning. It's understood that this is going to be the development agenda for all countries. So a lot more time and effort and seriousness, I think, is going into the negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals than went into its predecessor. And international organizations in particular are already starting to align with the Sustainable Development Goals, as are countries themselves. For the WFP in particular, the goal that obviously is closest to our hearts, and I think probably to yours as well, is the second goal, which is to end hunger, improve food security and nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Within that goal, which follows very closely for us, was the Secretary General's Zero Hunger Challenge, but that goal to end hunger, which although the Millennium Development Goals have a 2030 time frame, it's recognized that we need to end hunger by 2025, because you can't end extreme poverty by 2030 if you haven't eliminated hunger by 2025. So actually all of the efforts, the international coalition efforts, are focused on ending hunger by 2025. And that second goal has 5 targets, which together were negotiated and developed by the 3 Rome-based agricultural agencies. That's FAO, WFP, and IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So the 3 UN Rome-based organizations made recommendations to the member states in New York, and there are 5 targets for ending hunger, which effectively define what ending hunger means. First target essentially is everybody has access to food and nutrition at all times. Second target relates to eliminating malnutrition, which includes no underweight, but also no overweight, and no micronutrient deficiencies. Third target relates to increasing productivity and income for smallholder farmers or family farmers. The fourth target relates to ensuring that food systems are sustainable and resilient. And the fifth target relates to ensuring biodiversity of crops and animals and soil fertility. Okay. These are the 5 targets of the ending hunger goal, and effectively that defines what the international community means by ending hunger. And it should be linked also to the third target of that 12th goal, which is addressed to food waste and dramatically reducing food loss and waste. Nutrition is critical. We've learned this as an organization over the course of our work, where even in the most dire emergency situations where you're bringing food to people, it's not just about the bulk calories. And it can't just be about the bulk calories. It has to be about nutrition. And this is something that has taken us time to understand, but it's a core part of how we see our role in the world now. We're not just there to bring calories to people, we're there to bring the right kind of calories to people. And that's a responsibility that we feel that we have. And what that has meant for us is a dramatic increase in the number of nutritionists in our program. All country offices are supposed to have nutritionists now, and a very much more significant focus on nutrition and the nutritional content of the food that we are providing. What's also become clear to us over the years is that you have to be engaged in the broader food policy and program discussions going on within a country, that we're operating, even when we're providing emergency assistance, we're operating in a particular national context. And if you want the impact to be long-term and positive and sustainable, you need to work within that national food policy and program context. This means safety nets. It means national legislation also on addressing hunger issues. You have to work within that context. And if you don't, what you see in the long term, or you see that the positive work that you do when you're on the ground disappears when you leave. And you also see that there start to be two worlds. There is one world of increasingly governments with more capacities and governments legislating in this area. And then there is a world that is aside from that of humanitarian activities. And really, humanitarian activities are deal with the symptoms, but they don't deal with the root causes. You have to address the root causes, and what we understand is that the humanitarian work that we do needs to be done in such a way that it helps to address the root causes and doesn't become a problem in and of itself. And that's a lesson that we have also had to learn. You can be providing assistance to the same communities which may be in very dire situations because of conflict or natural disasters, but if you're doing the same thing for 20 years, something is not right. You need to change the way you are doing business, and so this focus on nutrition and on the broader safety net resilience context is also critical. And last, I'd like to just talk a little bit about how I think we can help each other. And in particular, we also understand as we look at and work more and more with middle-income countries that have put their own national zero hunger frameworks in place, but they need help implementing that. They need help from the international community. They need help from the private sector within the country. They need help from civil society. We, as a UN agency, we've always understood that we need to work closely with the private sector. And within the context of the UN, we're often regarded as kind of almost among the vanguard of working with the private sector. In a way, we have to, because we are a 100% voluntarily funded organization, mostly funded by governments. 99% is funded by governments, or 95%, but increasingly we as WFP are trying to work with the private sector, not just for the resources, but actually in a way, for me more importantly, because of the capacities that are in the private sector. We struggle to get the nutritionists that we need, and yet many private sector companies have a lot of nutritionists available. So we also need to understand how to work with private sector, and civil society is very critical for advocacy. I think one of the great things about food banking work is just it helps create a culture of people being engaged in the solutions to problems. It's not all government's responsibility to figure out and fix. And the fact that people take these responsibilities on themselves, are involved in how the solutions are rolled out, I think is very critical. From our standpoint, we work with governments in the places that we work. It's part of the way the UN works. We also obviously work very closely with our UN and international partners. And this is a way in which we can also help, particularly in countries where where food banking is less developed. It's a way in which we can also be helpful probably to you in terms of those discussions with government. Government is our primary partner, our primary counterpart, and I think we can be helpful to you in helping to understand how your work fits into broader government programs and policies. We can also, I think, be helpful in some of the training, the program, the advocacy aspects as you start to expand and get your programs get bigger in many of the places that you are. I think for you can help us understand urban environments better. Typically, as an organization, we focus on rural populations, and we focus on the least developed countries. Increasingly, food banking we see is quite important in middle-income countries and with urban populations. And we will have, one of my responsibilities is we will have a new policy for the organization on our work in urban environments. And I'd like for that, I would ensure that food banking is taken into account within that global policy for us. And so the more I can understand about the way you work, I think the better we'll be able to do that. Also, local engagement, your efforts in support of our overall advocacy for zero hunger and food and nutrition, and our working together on the program and policy agenda in countries is I think, something where we can both benefit and learn from. So I'm looking forward to the 2 days I'm able to spend here. I see it as I hope I can share with you some of our experience. And we heard this morning the experience from with Guatemala, WFP and Guatemala Food Bank. But I also am here very much to learn from you how you do your job, what you see are the priorities, and how, when we develop our policy on working in urban areas in particular, what do we need to factor in terms of how we work together and how we support and advocate for food banks? Because I see these as very complementary. If we work in urban areas, we only work with cash, so we would not be distributing commodities in urban areas. So it would be very important for us to understand how you're working and how we can complement each other's work. So thank you very much for your attention and for allowing me to be here for these 2 days together with you.